All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the December edition of the Roots to STEM seminar series. For those of you who've been with us before, welcome back. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, it's great to have you here. So by way of introduction, the seminar series is one that we started back in the fall of 2019. And the idea was to create a series where we would invite dynamic speakers and researchers from across campus to discuss both their research and their career paths. And so the idea was to recognize that our unique paths, experiences, and identities inform the way that we approach our research. And that diversity is very much a strength that enriches the research community. So today's speaker is one who I think really embodies the spirit of the series. So I'm very pleased to be introducing him. He is actually a slight departure from our usual speakers. So he's going to be our first speaker from the College of Business. And he also has a very unique and interesting career path. And he's also done really interesting and groundbreaking research in a topic that I think you'll all be familiar with. So Professor Joe Yoon is a professor of accounting and Director of Data Science Research Services at Geese College of Business. He also has affiliations with the Charles H. Sandich Department of Advertising, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, Illinois Informatics, and the Center for Health Informatics. His research is primarily focused on novel data science algorithms, user-centric analytic systems, and societal considerations of AI-based advertising and marketing. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to you, Joe. And thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Just as a preface, I wanted to mention a few things. First, I got my booster shot yesterday, and I didn't expect to be this out of it. So if I pass out, please just somebody get back up here and continue the presentation, and I'll somehow crawl out. Secondly, this is my first time doing actually this presentation. Usually I do presentations that I've done numerous times. So I have no idea if this is going to be 5 minutes or 30 minutes. So I'm going to try my best to make it a good presentation in light of the booster. And third, it's a lot of pressure to say that you all invite dynamic speakers. I don't know if I am myself. I would definitely say that my journey is a little bit different. And so today I'm going to talk about social media analytics and specifically my journey to understand my computational data and yours. So, boom. Okay, so I always try to start, I always try to start my presentations with just one idea, and hopefully this encapsulates my whole presentation and maybe what you all can walk away with. The big idea of the presentation is simply this. Control over our data is control over our lives, and we need to take back control. So I'll say that one more time. Control over our data is control over our lives, and we need to take back control. Now, I'm not going to tell you my whole story, but I will tell you a story about my career starting in 2014. My background going back before that is actually computer science. I've always been a computer nerd ever since I was a kid. I was a programmer and all these things. And later on, I started really getting interested in social psychology. And so I kind of took a huge path change from computer science. And I did computer science here, it's the greatest computer science school in the world. And I started studying social psychology, and specifically social psychology through the lens of advertising. My question really was, why are we so affected by persuasive messaging, or just messaging in general, or images or videos or whatever? And so as I was pondering on these questions in graduate school, I had the opportunity in 2014, I kind of got picked by the CIO at that time on his campus to start analyzing people via their data. Now, there was a very specific reason. He gave me a position of the leader of social media analytics for this campus. I had no idea what that meant. He had no idea what that meant. But what we did know is that during that time, it was kind of the first period of U of I where social media and what people were saying on social media were really affecting the institution. There was 2 or 3 chancellors ago, 2 or 3 provosts, maybe 4 or 5, I'm not sure, It was many, many leadership ago, and they were dealing with a series of really big social media issues surrounding the reputation of our university. And I don't know if some of you were here at that time, but various things, whether it be with regards to sports programs on our campus, or with regards to professors being offered jobs and then not being able to come to campus, and all these things. And so what the campus was doing at that time, which I totally understand, was trying to figure out like what's going on and how can social media so affect like everything. Now today we are like, obviously this all makes sense. But in 2014, it was like, what is this social media thing and why is it causing like such controversy? And so they were paying this PR firm, if you know a PR firm named Edelman, it's the biggest PR firm I think out there, just a ton of money at that time to try to figure out how to analyze social media. And I basically told my boss at that time, hey, like I see these reports that are coming out of this PR firm, and I think I can do it more accurately. I think I can do it more frequently. They'd send us a report every month, and my suggestion was, I think social media moves faster than that. You can't get a report every month. And I think I could do it a bit more in depth. And so what I asked for was a subscription to this company called Radian6. Now I want to tell you a little bit about companies like Radian6. Radian6 doesn't exist anymore. They were bought out by a couple other companies, and they are now called Brandwatch. But what I found out at that time was that part of how these social media companies like Twitter and Facebook and all these places, this isn't news to you now, but at that time it was news. How are they making all this money, right? That if we're not paying them, then where are they getting all their money? Now, you've probably all seen The Social Dilemma or something like that, and you realize now that the way that they get their money is by selling our data. Well, companies like Radian6 sprung up during that time, and they would buy all of our data, all the data from the social media platforms. They would warehouse it technically, and then they would offer these dashboards so that companies or even just wealthy people could analyze like what's going on in the world of our data at that time. And so what I did was I said, give me some money and let me start to look at this data. And so our campus allowed me to do that. And what I started doing, besides looking at all the controversies on our campus and trying to understand like what people are saying, I started looking at my own data because I'm sure all of you would do the same thing, right? You have access to this tool and then you're like, wait, what does this thing say about me? And I started finding all of these things. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. So like there was no internet when I was a kid. And yet there was all this stuff that I could find in these sites that I thought I deleted, that I thought like were just gone because the companies are gone, but it was still there and I could access it via these tools. And so I started freaking out. Privately, I started freaking out. I didn't tell anybody. And so what did I do? I started deleting, like I started trying to scour the internet and like reverse engineer what this Radian6 had about me and tried to find all the sites. And a lot of these sites didn't even exist. So I was trying to figure out like, how do I delete myself from the internet? Because a lot of the stuff, I said stupid things when I was like younger, or, I don't know, some things that you could probably misinterpret or whatnot. And I don't think I'm like a horrible person, but I'm just like, when you look at the data without context, it doesn't look good sometimes, right? Especially when I was like a preteen or something, right? And so I started to try to delete everything. And what I found was about a year later, so now we're in 2015, I was preparing a talk for undergraduates about social media and protecting your reputation with regards to social media. In fact, I had a series of presentations on this campus, where at that time I would tell students like, hey, like you need to really watch what you're putting out there for your sake, right? And at that time, it wasn't a big thing like it is now where people are like, oh my gosh, like this stuff could be used against me. So what I did at that time was I searched Radian6 again, and I was confident. I deleted most of my stuff. And what I found was like these ghost images of my data that was still out there. Because what I forgot was that Radian6 is just one company. There's thousands, maybe even tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Radian6s that all bought data from these social media companies. And all of them did different things with regards to if you go to Facebook and delete your data on Facebook, what does Radian6 do on their system for that same piece of data? Or what does Brandwatch do? Or what does Dell do? Dell was a big player at that time. What does, et cetera, companies do? And so I started realizing like, I'm never gonna delete my data. This stuff is out there. And a lot of times it's incomplete data. So it looks kind of like these pictures here, where it kind of looks like me, but it's not the full data, which makes it even worse, right? Because it could be misinterpreted. And then this was just kind of brewing in my head. And by the way, I was doing this as a master's student, but I was working full time for the CIO because it was just really cool what he was, allowing me to do for this campus. And then during that time, and he's still a great mentor of mine. He actually is a CIO of University of Pittsburgh right now, which I'll share. I'm actually going to. But he told me during that time, he said, you should do a PhD. I said, what? I said, I want to do a PhD. And he said, yeah, you need to do a PhD. And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. What am I supposed to do? And he's like, just study what you're already studying right now, the stuff that you're interested in. I said, well, what I'm interested in is like, what is social media and social data doing to us in our psychologies as human beings, for our society, all of these things. And he's like, just study that. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And then I found somebody in advertising who eventually became my advisor, and who said, yeah, you know what? Like, I have the social psych side, you have the computer science side. Let's bring it together and let's start your PhD. Right around that time, I started my PhD in 2018, so it hasn't been that long. While working full time, which is just weird. Okay. And I just had a kid at that time, so it was just like crazy life. The Cambridge Analytica scandal happened. Now, I don't know if you remember this scandal. It was during the elections, or the 2018 elections, but basically what was happening was that this company, Cambridge Analytica, they were going on to sites like Facebook, and they were asking people to take these seemingly benign personality quizzes. I'm sure if you remember those times, like you'd go on Facebook and it'd be like, do you want to know like what kind of person you are? And blah, blah, blah. And you're like, yeah, I do. And you're like, I'm not getting paid for this. I don't care. I'm just going to do it, right? Because I did it too. I was just like, yeah, it seems fun. And I start filling out all these personality tests. And then you start realizing like, what is this for? Right? Like, what is this being used for? And what I started realizing when Cambridge Analytica hit was that they were collecting everybody's psychological profiles. And then they had access via tools like Radiant6 to everybody's other data on Facebook. So if you could imagine, if they had access to my data, they had the answers to my psychological tests. They have answers to everything that I like and dislike, political figures, music, whatever you can put on social media. And then you add to that machine learning, which is basically just statistically trying to correlate things as much as possible so that you can then later on predict how people are or what people like or dislike according to just pieces of that data, right? And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with machine learning at this point, so I won't go too much into that, but they take all of that. And then what they did was they used computational advertising, Facebook ads and social media ads for political purposes. Because then they could see that, hey, I can predict what people's affiliations or what people have a tendency towards with regards to political affiliations. And then I'll use now advertising, persuasive messaging to reach those people. And many people say that this really did affect our elections, and it continues to affect our elections today. But my big question was, like, how big of a deal is this, right? Is it just advertising and just a little bit more customized? Or is there something going on here where we as social psychological beings kind of have no protection against this? Because maybe from an evolutionary standpoint, like there's never been anything like this before. And now we're getting hit with this and we don't even know. There's a theory in advertising, or it's actually in psychology, called mere exposure. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's incredibly powerful. It's actually from psychology, like we're talking about 50 plus years. As a pretty sound theory that's been proven over and over again. And mere exposure theory basically says that even though we don't think that we're affected by just mere exposure to things or symbols or words or whatever, you can do experiments over and over and over again where, for example, if I had just written some symbol here in the corner of this room, never talked about it, and it's there, and I just did a lecture, and then everybody left, and then I gave you a test saying, which symbol do you like better? This one, and then a bunch of other symbols that you've never seen. And on average, we'll all choose that symbol, even though we didn't focus on it at all. Why? Because there's something that psychologically happens, maybe from an evolutionary standpoint, where once we are familiar with something, even a little bit, there's a little bit more traction to it. And so I started thinking, like, this hyper personalization and customization using machine learning, like, is this stuff that we should like outlaw or talk about or what? And so what I started to do was I said, okay, like, I'm just going to dive deep into this. And one of the first things that myself and a few other friends in computer science and various other fields started to do was we started to create a system. We said, okay, Radian 6 costs like $100,000 a year. We're going to start creating open source software so that researchers and students and all these people can start to do this themselves, right? And we're going to build these tools. Now, granted, we didn't have and we don't have the resources to buy everybody's data. So you have limited data, but with regards to the tools that we built out, and this is open source and this is available on the web right now. It's pretty advanced. And so we first built a tool so that we could do real-time understanding of what's going on with regards to analyzing social media data using machine learning and data science. This is an example of one of the tools that we built where you can literally go into this dashboard and you can start pulling social media data. You can start analyzing it using pretty cool data science techniques, so on and so forth. Then what I found at that time, this is 2000, well, they wrote this in 2017, but it kind of became popularized in around 2018-19, was that IBM had in their research labs taken a bunch of people and had them take psychology tests, and then also got permission from them to analyze their Twitter data and then use machine learning to see if that they could predict their psychologies via their Twitter data, or vice versa, they could predict their Twitter activity via their psychologies, right? And then they presented that model so that researchers could use it. And so I started to look around and with that model and started using it. And the way it kind of worked was this, right? So if you took somebody out there and took their tweets, you got enough of their tweets, you could, to a fair degree of accuracy, which was actually pretty good at that time. Like, it's like not like random. It's like, hey, this is getting to a statistical standpoint where, like, it's scary, right? That I could detect from your tweets how extroverted you are, or how neurotic you might be, or how agreeable you might be, right? Just from your harvested tweets. And so then what we did next was, well, this is the tool. We built a tool around this study. I started asking, like, is there a phenomenon going on in Twitter where if I calculate people's personalities and I calculate like personalities of brands as they present themselves on Twitter, like, do people generally, if you're familiar with this concept of homophily, where like things congregate towards other like things, right? It's kind of also a psychological phenomenon that, without even knowing it, that you're just tending to follow people on Twitter that are more similar to you in psychology, or brands that are more similar to you in psychology than not following brands that are not as similar. So we did this whole kind of like matrix mathematics, combination of all of this. And what we found was, like, this was happening. This was happening out there. And you have to really ask yourself, like, is that how I interact with people on social media? I think to myself, that person has a very similar psychological makeup as I do. And so therefore, because they're so similar to me, I'm going to start listening to them, following them, et cetera, et cetera. No, it's just, I don't know, I like them. Like, I'm gonna follow them. I like this, I'm gonna click on it. But maybe what's happening underneath all of that is this psychological mechanism. And again, some people are realizing that this could potentially be used, against us. And all of this, and this is kind of my big idea, is only possible by having full access to our data. Is that by having everything about me, you can build these models about me, and then you can use those models against me. And so that really begs the question, like, should you have my data, right? Now, by the way, I do LinkedIn because you just need that professionally, I guess, for your career, apparently. But like everything else, I don't do. Like, I don't put my stuff out there. I don't put my kids' pictures on the internet. All these things, because I am super paranoid about all of this data and what's happening with it. And it's weird because I'm a computational advertising researcher, but much of what I research is we got to change computational advertising because it's not ethical. And so here's the question. If you take people's psychologies and then you add AdWords or whatever advertising, computational advertising method, Google ads, et cetera, Facebook ads, does that equal influence? Does that equal control? Does that equal power over us, right? And I'm not saying I know the answer. I think it's a very open question, but it's actually not being, as far as I've seen, researched as much as I think it should be. And then, of course, in 2020, many of us saw this documentary, The Social Dilemma. This is funny. I'll tell you a funny thing about this documentary. I researched this stuff, and like I talk to my wife about this stuff like all the time, and she's always just like, why won't you like let me put our kids' pictures on Instagram? And I'm just like, okay, do I have to go through this again? Over and over and over, right? And then she watched this with me, and then she turned to me during this documentary. I'm not joking around, like 20 minutes, and she's like, oh my gosh, is this what you're talking about? And I'm like, yes. But I was so happy because I was just like, you know what? There's value in documentaries. There's value in what they did here, because it took this, I couldn't explain it as well as them, but it took this to explain that all of our data is being used for advertising, and it's really affecting us in ways that we maybe can't even comprehend. And one of the things that they also talk about is that we just have no defense against this because we don't even know what's happening. We don't know what's going on. Well, obviously, now this is being talked about a lot, right? When I started talking about this, was that 6 years or 7 years ago, everybody's like, what are you talking about, right? But now everybody's like, you're not the customer of Facebook, you are the product, and all this stuff. So what has happened? The business model for our data has evolved, because now it's kind of evil to like buy people's data and to do all this stuff, right? So all the companies are saying, I loved when Google said, hey, we're not scanning your emails anymore for advertising purposes. We've stopped those practices. And I thought, and it's like they're like publicizing this. And I'm like, wait, you were scanning our emails for advertising purposes and you didn't tell us? So why is it cool that now you're saying, oh, we're gonna stop? Well, how about you say that you shouldn't have started in the first place, right? So a lot of these companies for PR's sake are saying, okay, and again, I don't wanna paint these companies as evil. I'm just saying, this is what's happening. And I have many of my peers that I did PhD with that work for Google and work for Facebook, but we talk about this all the time, right? The data now and this whole process has kind of gone underground. So what's happened is there's still all these kind of vague images of me and my data, but they're only accessible by very wealthy companies, maybe very wealthy nations or whatever it may be. It's kind of like the commercial market for people that small businesses or whatever that want to buy this data. It's not available anymore because it's like a bad PR mess. And so it's kind of evolved into this, those with greater resources and greater power still have access to the data and others don't. Well, what has been another unintended, or I'm guessing, I'm going to say it's an unintended consequence of having all this data and then advertising with this data is actually misinformation and fake news, right? Because fake news is not just let me just randomly choose some story that could not be true and just broadcast it out there. It's let me choose stories that I know that certain people will believe, and let me send them their stories via advertising, right? And so this is just, this is a kind of a complicated graph, but this is a study that a few of us are currently working on, that we're on an NSF grant to study COVID misinformation. And one of the questions that we had was simply, does labeling of misinformation help, right? That people stop engaging as much with it or sharing if you label it as this is misinformation. And basically what this graph says, without going too much into it, is that, yeah, it actually substantially works. And so that was a really cool thing, right, that we found in the study. But another thing that we found in the study, and we only found it because Facebook, to give them credit, they gave us unprecedented access into their data, probably because of this NSF grant, so that we could study this. And what we found was something that was so weird, which was, we found that Facebook, who is kind of viewed as evil nowadays, was actually doing a really good job, as much as compared to others, of labeling misinformation and taking down misinformation. Now there's so much volume that it still gets out there, but they are taking down millions of posts and labeling millions of posts. And you know who was not? We literally, there were days we were pulling hundreds of thousands of posts a day. We had a direct stream from Facebook, and then we had a direct stream from Twitter. And who was not labeling any of the misinformation or taking it down was Twitter. And it was one of those weird things where unless you had direct access to this data, you would think the opposite looking at media today, that like Twitter is the more responsible one and Facebook is the less responsible one when it comes to COVID misinformation and fake news. And we found the opposite. And that started making me think, hey, another problem with like our data being everywhere is that the people that should have access to it, like academic researchers, right? And I'm not saying that it should be like no privacy. I'm just saying that if there's going to be companies that are using this against us, there needs to be some like people that are trying to analyze this to see what's going on and how it can be mitigated. But academic researchers, by and large, don't have access to this data. In fact, if you find something that's a little bit too anti, the business model, you get shut down, which some of our colleagues at NYU just got shut down for that research. And so this happened recently, I guess in September, end of September. We were invited actually by the House of Representatives Science Committee, and we were, this is the PI of my NSF grant. He was a witness for a congressional hearing that was entitled "The Disinformation Black Box: Researching Social Media Data." And one of the things that we told congressional members was that, hey, like, we as academic researchers, we need more access to understand what's going on, right? Is that if there's all this stuff happening with our data, like, we have no ability to research like what's happening, right? What is actually the truth out there with regards to how this data is being shared, where it's going, how it's being processed, and all these things, because all the tech companies keep really close reins on that data, and that we can only get what they give us, which many times is just, a very small view of what's going on. And I actually suggested that just like we have Fermi Labs or Sandia National Laboratories in our nation where we're studying like nuclear energy because nuclear can be beneficial, but it can also be devastating, right? That I suggested maybe we should create some kind of social data laboratories in our nation to study the effects of social data and social media on the fabric of our sociology and our psychologies. Because I genuinely believe it's that impactful right now, and it's affecting us all in ways that we don't even understand, that I don't understand. And they were very open to that, so we're having ongoing conversations about what the federal government, specifically NSF and NIH and these agencies can help to create. So, how much time I went through here? Big idea, control over our data is control over our lives. We need to take back control. So some of my thoughts lately is that we need a national infrastructure for social data research. I just mentioned that. I also think that we need a new model and infrastructure for computational advertising, because I don't think advertising should cease to exist. It will never cease to exist. But we need to change the model, and specifically, we need to change the infrastructure. Now, that's a whole nother talk, but I have some ideas. And then we need new models of data ownership and privacy, because whether people realize it or not, I think everybody, if you truly understand what's going on, then I think everybody would have at least some sense of, hey, maybe I need to make a bit more informed decisions when it comes to my privacy and when it comes to my data. And everybody should have that, that opportunity to know this and to make that decision. One of the reasons why I tell my wife, like, I don't want any of my kids' data out there is because I want them to make their own decision. I'm not going to control it once they're older. If they want it, once they're, at the age where they can do social media and they want to just put everything out there, I'm going to let them do it. But they're at an age where they can do it. But when they're babies, like, I don't feel comfortable making that decision for them. And I'm not judging anyone that does. I'm just saying, that's just me and how I view it. And then I just threw this out here as like I don't know, I'm just a nerd. So this is my new vision, blockchain. And why do I say that? Because if we could change actually the infrastructure of computational advertising to be Web 3.0, it could enable greater transparency, restore privacy, distribute power, bring actual value to consumers, because advertising brings almost no value to us. And then it could be an infrastructure where we can disentangle from politics, because I really think political advertising should be like some kind of separate, very regulated thing from other advertising, because it can really destroy, the fabric of our society. Whatever position anybody has, it just shouldn't be something that's like you don't even know what's happening to you, right? And so, anyways, I'm not going to talk about this, but this is another major thing that I'm working on that I'm really excited about, because I think this could bring some solution to all of this mess. So with that said, it was mentioned that I am at Geese. I'm actually at the end of this month moving to University of Pittsburgh. I'll be the AI and innovation architect and a professor in electrical computer engineering. And I think I'm going to try to build out this whole blockchain thing out there. We'll see. But I would love for you to contact me if you'd like to. And this is my new email over there. So thank you. I take questions or? Okay. Any questions? Sure.
Like on some level, you always think like, who cares? They have my data. This is the thing. You know, I'm going to someday on my phone number and show up. But you know, advertising is regulated.
Yeah.
You know, you don't allow helping. You don't like you have regulations. I'm very interested in like traffic violence and how like cars are advertised as these weapons, and so I follow a lot of like. We should, you know, I would love to have more regulation that says cars can't be used as weapons in advertisement, and so on and so forth. So I love your idea of like an FDA for this type of data.
Yep.
I know I saw a lecture, another woman, I had, you know, I think my back is, yeah, it's okay. I haven't seen it all. And I'm like, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm well aware, and I have tried to scrub my data and do these things, but I just remember one thing, like, you know, why are like 18, you know, why are these kids, they have all this data out there on them, and they don't even know, and they don't even stand a chance.
Yep.
So I really like your argument about like, this is changing the social fabric, and you know, Facebook has dropped it, has done, you know, has overturned government, they have.
Yep.
It's a fact.
Undeniable.
It's undeniable fact, yeah. So I just really think I do like the idea of approach you're trying to take to deal with government, a lot of people try to back stuff like that.
Thank you. And I do also want to mention, I mean, blockchain is, it sounds like a fad, but like you can regulate TV advertising because everybody sees the same thing. But how do you regulate hyper customized advertising that everybody sees some nuanced different advertising, right? It's impossible. The thing about blockchain is it records every single action forever in a transparent way on the blockchain. Therefore, if you have enough computing power and the right algorithms, you could actually do like computational regulation, where you actually then go back through everything that has been advertised the last year from every company. I know it sounds crazy, but you know, with our compute now, we can do it. And so then you can actually do how traditional advertising has been regulated before. It's just that we live in the wild, wild west right now. There's no chance for the government to regulate it. So they just don't. And so. Yep. 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 Exactly. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, so that's a great question. And for COVID misinformation, we're actually working with the WHO Pan-American Health Organization. So my colleagues over there largely speak Spanish. And they've been doing this same research with us, but for Spanish-speaking countries, it's worse. Because all the algorithms that are trying to find the misinformation and tag it, they're all English. And so for Spanish-speaking countries, and I can only imagine for other countries, other languages, it's just like there's nothing. Like there's just, you have no chance to find true information, you know, because you're being inundated by all this spam, and it's rough. So, but that's the only one so far. We've been talking about it. My team, we're growing, and we're including people from all these different parts of the world. And so the hope is that, I don't know what we're trying to build, but we're just like, we all have the same thought. Like, how do we like make this better? And so I'm hoping that we'll get into more and more languages. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah, great question. Okay, so first of all, GDPR is so awesome. Like, I think it's so awesome. but they passed it. I'm pretty sure knowing that there's no way that it can actually be enforced because technically it's almost impossible. It's just like, is Twitter in charge of Radian 6's version of Twitter about me, right? So that when I say to Twitter, delete my account, do they contact Radian 6 and all these other mirror companies to delete my data, right? The reality is Twitter doesn't even have records probably from back in the day of who they sold the data to, right? And so when I say it's impossible to enforce, I'm saying it's technically impossible to actually accomplish what GDPR is saying that it's trying to accomplish. With that said, the fact that there's a law like that, one thing that it has done, it has caused companies to stop doing practices or not start doing practices that will create the scenario that we're in right now. So like, for example, now that GDPR has passed, Twitter is not going to sell our data to people without knowing exactly what's happening with that data if they're in the EU region, because they know that if the EU says, hey, like delete Joe Yoon, he lives in Germany or something like that, and then they can track it out. Twitter has to prove now, yeah, like we can't find all the data from 2015 because that was before the regulation. But today we have the systems so that everything from when GDPR was put in place to now, we can find all of Joe's data. So that's been really awesome, is that they've forced the companies to figure out new systems to make sure they can dial back like where our data is and to delete it. That doesn't exist in America, right? So they still do the same stuff here, except in California because of the Consumer Privacy Act. But GDPR has been, I think in that sense, it's caused big firms to now put in the technical infrastructure so that our data is better protected. I'd like to see that everywhere. Yeah.
So you mentioned but one of the really nice things that a lot of people love about social media is this idea of democratizing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a handful of really powerful people who control what information general public has.
Yeah.
But even small people can now get information out there. Sometimes that information is inconvenient for people.
Yeah.
So how do we manage misinformation while also maintaining that democratizing effect?
Yeah.
So that you don't allow very powerful people to sort of control and suppress information that might be accurate, but might just not be true.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Okay, like this is a whole rabbit hole, but okay, first of all, what is truth? Okay, like, and that's complicated, right? Like what is true information? What is misinformation? What is some flavor of in between, right? But with that said, I think the easier question, or not the easier question, the more straightforward question, at least compared to that, is when you have media that is largely controlled by powerful organizations and figures, and there's kind of this mismatch between power structures, then how can you deal with that system, right? So one of the reasons why we're interested in blockchain, again, not just because it's a fad. One of the things from social psychology that has proven to be true over many decades is that when you're talking about trust, especially trust in information and trust in organizations, people tend to have greater trust in things that they feel like they've contributed to, that they've been a part of, right? They've had a voice in. I mean, this makes total, like, this is like kind of like, I don't have to say it, right? But social psych research has done a lot in this. And so it's proven over and over. Well, for example, like if you see a study on COVID-19 that says COVID immunizations you're good for you, right? But then you're somebody that says like, yeah, but that's from the NIH and Fauci and I don't trust them. And so like, and they're like just government that's trying to oppress us. I'm not going to believe in that, right? But what if you had a system where that study had a way, let's say via blockchain, to include that your data about your whatever visit or doctor's visit or immunization without identifying you, but somehow that you can identify only you, that you were a data point in that study, something happens psychologically where it's not just like, oh, that's that study over there. It's like that study includes me, right? And you start to say, oh, like I was in that study. And so I was one of the data points. And you start to say, I think I trust that study a little bit more. As weird as that sounds, that's just how it works psychologically, right? So we start asking ourselves, like, if we can start to build even like scientific publishing systems, media systems, where like maybe part of the story is not just what one organization has put out there, but some kind of conglomeration of people. It's kind of like a good example of this is with weather, right? That when you see like a tornado touchdown warning, it's actually either sensors that picked it up, or there's people that are like storm watchers that go around and then they'll actually say, I saw the tornado. And that's how our current national weather system works, is that sometimes, and you'll hear it, they'll say like something like storm watchers saw a touchdown of a tornado and blah, 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 right? Those people are very invested in that reporting, right? And so my question is, if we can figure out an infrastructure that doesn't allow for hacking and all these anonymous people that are just trying to mess with things, that actually identify people and that we can all participate in this, I think there's a chance to kind of get at what you're asking about, which is it's not just like one group of people that have, status in a power structure that just controls all the information to everybody else. And so that's one thing. I mean, this is very early on, but like we're playing around with these ideas. Anything else? Thank you.